is truly a pleasure to announce today's speaker. If you've heard me speak up here several times, I often talk about our circle and how important everyone is within it. Our speaker today is a very important part of that circle. As he comes and joins us often, gives us insight, gives us wisdom, gives us humor. Tom Baker has had quite a journey in his life. From being a young child and becoming a Catholic priest and making the decision to leave that life and to see much more of the world and what's going on and being able to see beyond that. Tom is a counselor, he's a minister of this church, and we thoroughly enjoy his messages that he gives us. Tom, I'm glad you're part of our circle, and I know as I sit back in that chair, as always, I am going to receive a message that I'm going to enjoy listening to, but more importantly, I'm going to receive a message that's going to touch my heart. And it's a message that I'll be able to take forth and share. So I'd like to introduce Tom Baker. Thank you.
Let's see, let me have a little water or whatever is in this jug here. I think last time there was vodka in here. Some holy person turned it back to water. That would be the retrograde Jesus, wouldn't it? He turns vodka back into water. Well, I'm going to talk about today forgiving my father. I figure it's summertime, and there's no feast, as Lloyd said. There's no holiday, so there's no real occasion. But forgiveness is a daily thing. It's a thing which removes the blocks to love so that love's presence may be a part of us and be shown to everybody. So I'm going to talk about forgiving my father. When my wife and I decided to get married, I knew that it was time for Kathy to meet my dad. She'd already met my mother. My mother was a gregarious, gracious woman who could be the hallmark poster woman for Mother's Day. In fact, Kathy had met my mother without me present. I didn't feel she needed my supervision. My father was a different story. As we drove towards my parents' house, I prepared Kathy for the worst. You know the story about Dad, I said. He's an atheist. He's kind of wild. Sometimes in restaurants he would make reservations for Sigmund Freud and family, or Joseph Stalin and his wife and kids, or simply the Swiss Family Robinson. And he will talk about death at least once, and we'll probably visit the cemetery because my father has always been terrified of death, but always liked to look death in the eye, as he said, and then leave the cemetery under his own power. And he might tell an off-color joke or suddenly break into song or just stay in his room. The more I described my father, the more worried I became. Until by the time we arrived, I was about ready to turn around and go back to Virginia Beach and meet next Christmas. Kathy, on the other hand, was fascinated. I can't wait to meet him, she said. He sounds like his old man. In fact, he sounds a lot like you. Almost did turn around at that point. But Kathy put her hand on my arm and said, "Let me draw my own conclusions. We both may be surprised." Well, I was certainly surprised. My father met us at the door and ushered us in like royalty. As we made small talk with my mother, my father started rummaging around in a closet and pulled out a scrapbook. "Kathy," he said, "I love this boy." And he sat in a chair next to me and put his arm around me and showed Kathy picture after picture of his amazing son. Kathy looked very surprised, but pleased, and I was astonished. My father had never told me that he loved me, at least not directly. He'd tell my mother and she'd tell me, or he'd tell his friend Bob Dolack, that he was so proud of me. And Bob would relay the compliment in Bob's sports metaphors. Your dad's your biggest fan. You're a first stringer in your father's eyes. Your dad thinks you're a champ. But I always wanted to hear it directly, up close, personal, nose to nose, like I imagine Fred McMurray talking to his 3 sons. Yet my father was extremely generous and impulsively kind. One time when I was a junior in college, my mother called me, and I told her that I was out of money. I spent my allowance on Beatles albums. I would have to miss dinner that night because the cafeteria was closed on Sunday evenings and wouldn't open until the next morning. You'll have to miss a meal, Tommy. Yes, Mom, I said, I think I'll make it. I don't think I've ever missed a meal before, so just this once won't hurt. Well, I could hear my mother calling to my father, Paul, Paul, Tommy has nothing to eat. My mother said later that a look of panic came over my father's face, and he rushed from the house. He's on his way, she said. My father drove 80 miles on a Sunday night to buy me a hamburger and a piece of pie. After he left, I remember thinking, after I burped, well, that was nice, but he never said that he loved me. I was a critical little cuss, a little obsessive too. Now my wife looked back at me over the scrapbook with questioning eyes. I know how you feel, Paul. I love him too. He's quite a guy. They both nodded wisely, and I squirmed in my chair. My wife said on the way home that she had met a different man that I had described, or at least a much nicer man that I had described, that I might rethink how I thought of my father. What was there not to like? Thus began the process of forgiveness. Notice I say process. Forgiveness is often a gradual letting go of an idea or the letting go of a story we have about a person. My story about my father was quite compelling for me. In my story about my father, I had gotten the wrong dad. The Lone Ranger, Sky King, Fred McMurray. Anybody but Paul Baker would have been better. He was big, clumsy, irritable, unpredictable, dedicated in his own way to fatherhood, but not personal about it. At 6'4", a distant figure in the sky, kind of like the God of the Old Testament, a strong presence who cared, but you never knew what was coming next. Was my story correct? It was a child's impression, a cartoon of a giant father and me, a little boy, who wanted to be as close to my father as I was to my mother. As I grew into a bigger boy, I wanted my father to be like Jesus. In my story, my father had an impossible part to play, especially for who he was. Paul Baker was an orphan, abandoned by his parents at birth during the Depression and given to his father's parents to raise. In their poverty, he was just another mouth to feed. My father was a resented child. He endured his life by getting lost in books, hiding out from his apathetic and critical parents in the library. My father barely survived his childhood. He dropped out of high school and ended up being a country music disc jockey. They called them announcers in those days. He had a voice like velvet from Memphis. My mother fell in love with his voice on the radio. They married, and they had me. The first song I learned as a child was "Your Cheatin' Heart." I still know a little bit of it. Your cheating heart will tell on you. Your cheating heart, oh, it'll make you blue. You'll walk the floor the whole night through. Your cheating heart will make you blue. Yeah? Now, people are easier to forgive when you know them as people. When we're children, we know people as the roles they play. In adulthood, we begin to know people as the people they are. But even as people, they may still get us down. Every day, when my father got home from work, he would drop his heavy briefcase with a thump and say, "Another day in hell." That was after he gave up radio and got a job as a paper salesman so he could make more of that filthy stuff called money. The person my father was depressed and angry. Finally, he was just simply hard for me to like. I wrote him letters, and he never wrote me back. He didn't want our Christmas gifts. The more I knew about my father, the more I concluded that I didn't like him, but I still wanted to forgive him. The negativity I had toward my father weighed me down. I thought more about the father I didn't like than about the people in my life that I loved. You ever notice you do that? The people you don't like, you get stuck on. The people you love, you forget. Huh. I finally turned to God and declared I didn't know what to do. What I knew did not help me to release him. What I did know is that my sister and my father had grown very close. She adored him. My wife and everyone at the nursing home adored him as well. I figured that God adored him too. There was something I was not seeing, perhaps that I would never see. I had to declare my own ignorance about his soul, his character, his being. My father was a mystery. He was beyond my understanding. He was a nut I couldn't crack, an egg I couldn't fry, a code I couldn't break. And suddenly, that was okay. If God did not condemn him, then neither would I. It was that simple. There's a saying from A Course in Miracles that goes like this: the holiest place on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love. My father died last June. In my grief, I've thought often about what my wife said to me on the way home from meeting my dad. That I had not described the man she had met. Today I think that all those years of not forgiving my father had more to do with me than with him. I was quick to point out his contradictions, but very slow to notice my own. Quick to feel unloved when I was not so loving myself. Today I can honestly say that I love my father, but I do not understand the love that I have. It is beyond stories and fantasies and dreams come true. It is the love beyond understanding. It is the love of God, the Father of us all. Thank you.